The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and the First Tennessee Foundation.
How do African Americans speak with their own voice? The only way to do that is to print their own words, publish their own words, and disseminate their own words.
Black people, African Americans, were kind of invisible otherwise. Their accomplishments were ignored, but their failings were amplified in the white press.
African Americans in white newspapers are exaggerated figures. There's no real mechanism for getting into just the day-to-day lives of African Americans. And that's something that's really missing. That's a real value in terms of African American newspapers of this period.
The old Southern voice that was once heard and made the Negroes jump and run like rats to their holes is shut up, or might well be. For the Negro of today is not the same as Negroes were 30 years ago, and it can't be expected that the Negro of today will take what was forced upon him 30 years back. So it is no use to be talking now about Negroes ought to be kept at the bottom, where God intended them to stay. The Negro is not intended to stay at the bottom.
The black press in Tennessee sprang from the hopes and dreams of an enslaved population's newly acquired freedom, a people whose skin color often determined their fate, whose value was equated with private property, and whose voices were either filtered or unheard.
It was generally a case of, we're here, we need to be seen, you need to hear us, and we need to speak to each other about the things that are important to us, although they might not be important to you. They are internal conversations that need to be held.
If African Americans do not have a voice in that, then somebody else is going to tell their story.
With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the end of the Civil War, and passage of the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery in 1865, African Americans in the South saw the opportunity to raise their visibility, viability, and unchained voices through the printed word. Tennessee was among the first states in the South to produce a black-owned newspaper, to appease the hunger for communication and connection among former slaves.
When you look at the history of African American journalism in Tennessee, you see a real strong theme of political and civic activism in all of those different newspapers. And of course it begins at the first with the Colored Tennessean. The Colored Tennessean is created right after the end of the Civil War. Lincoln's been assassinated, Robert E. Lee has surrendered, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessean, is now president. But there was a call for a free African American press. And it came about here in Nashville with the Colored Tennessean, started by William Scott.
What shall we do with him? This is the question troubling many well-meaning persons. The him does not mean their self, or any special person with whom they are related. It refers to a class whom some of the inquirers condemn and pretend to despise, others again to patronize and pity. We mean the Negro. Deal with us justly. Tell us not that we will not work when it was our toil that enriched the South. We were born here. Most of us will die here. We are Americans, and prouder of the fact than ever. Deal justly with us. That's all we want. That we mean to have, come what may.
Out of emancipation, I think there was, I would call it today, the desire, the belief that we had reached a post-racial society, that we were going forward. African Americans were going forward. And there were elected officials. There were 2 U.S. senators, both from Mississippi. And on the local level, there were African Americans being elected to office. So William B. Scott Sr. started a paper at a time when it looked as though things were going forward. That seemed to be his overwhelming theme. I think he used such slug lines as Ethiopia lifts up her arms unto God and things that suggested equality and pushed for equality.
Many stories in the colored Tennessean were related to concerns and needs of former slaves, such as educational opportunities and activities of the Freedmen's Bureau, farm and home ownership for Negroes, but most of the content was about politics. William Scott was very politically minded, which is what brought him to Nashville in August 1865 to attend the first Negro Convention in Tennessee.
He came from East Tennessee to Nashville to attend this political convention that African Americans from across the state came to sort of create their own political agenda and establish their rights as freemen. A lot of it had to do with the right to vote, equal rights as citizens, all of which would happen in the next few years as the different amendments to the Constitution were approved.
Front-page ads through the period were nothing unusual, and often the ads appeared in copy. First of all, compared to a newspaper these days, it was incredibly dull. It was quite gray. There weren't photos, and they were not that lively in terms of the reporting and storytelling.
Even without photos, the printed words of these early newspapers were very revealing about the concerns, needs, and goals of African Americans after the Civil War.
The early newspapers, as the Colored Tennessean, for example, 1865 to 66 publications, also provided social services to former slaves and freedmen after the war. For example, you will find many advertisements in the Colored Tennessean where people are looking for their relatives who were split up during slavery times.
Information is wanted on my mother, whom I left in Fauquier County, Virginia in 1844, and I was sold in Richmond, Virginia to Samuel Copeland. I formerly belonged to Robert Rogers. I am very anxious to hear from my mother.
My children were sold at Clack Robinson's sale in Warren County near Roanoke, Virginia, some 20 years ago. Their names were Sterling, Louisa, and Rebecca Ann.
Information is wanted of my 2 boys, James and Horace, one of whom was sold in Nashville, and the other who was sold in Rutherford County.
$200 reward. During the year 1849, Thomas Sample carried away from this city as his slaves our daughter Polly and son George Washington.
Information wanted of Carolyn Dotson, who was sold from Nashville November 1st, 1862, by James Lumsden to Warwick, a trader then in human beings, who carried her.
You had many who were wandering around the country, sometimes trying to see what's happening or find out where's their place now, some trying to find relatives. That's not a stable audience to preserve and to promote an African American press.
Money was hard to come by for former slaves. While they could now get paid for their labor, the wages were often very low and less than other workers. Literacy was another challenge for newspapers in Tennessee. At the end of the Civil War, most African Americans in the South were illiterate because it had been illegal to teach a slave to read and write. With the opening of schools to educate former slaves, literacy among blacks in the South dropped to about 75% by 1880, meaning about 1 in 4 Southern blacks could read. As literacy continued to improve, by 1900, more than half of Southern blacks could read and write.
There was a high pass-around rate. One person buys the paper and they pass it around to a lot of others, but you're being read. It helps your circulation rate, it doesn't help your finances. One writer indicated that many of the readers must have been white because the black audience, the literate black audience, was so small that many of the readers must have been white. And if the community became uncomfortable with you, you had a good chance of being out of business.
The politics of publishing were complicated for black newspapers. Many had to rely on white readers as well as white-owned printing companies to produce their papers. and in some cases provide an editorial endorsement.
William Scott, a colored citizen of East Tennessee, has issued several numbers of a very neatly printed weekly newspaper in this city bearing the above title. The editor seems to be laboring earnestly to improve and enlighten his race and, so far as we have noticed, displays much taste and judgment in his labors. We hope that every colored family in Nashville, as in the North, will encourage and sustain this laudable effort to elevate and educate the colored race in the country, as they should be elevated and educated in their new condition as free men. We wish the Tennessean much success.
A lot of times you see a paper that lasted for a year or less, it could be that the printer just got tired of you by then. Might not have been financial, it might have been political, and stopped printing.
William Scott had an advantage. He and his son owned and operated a printing business even before launching their newspaper. But for reasons not entirely clear, the Colored Tennessean was produced for just 2 years, from 1865 to 1867. Scott then relocated his publication to East Tennessee, Maryville. He named it the Maryville Republican, toned down the editorial content, making it the only newspaper in Blount County for at least a decade.
There he establishes not only different newspapers, he was sort of the Maryville newspaper man for the next 10 years. He also became very active in creating schools. And the Freeman's Normal Institute is one of his most important achievements. But then the fact that often gets forgotten about Scott, he was also elected mayor of Maryville at that time in about 1869, after African Americans got the right to vote and he could run as a candidate. And he is still the only African American to ever serve as mayor of Maryville today. So it's a real interesting arc that he starts with his activism.
Scott's move to Maryville and his subsequent success there might reflect the region's unique views on race and government. East Tennessee had a very small slave population due in part to its geography and mountains. It also was home to many Quakers and others opposed to or ambivalent about slavery and pro-union throughout the Civil War. It was a favorable environment for black newspapers and politicians. Another who became a major figure was William F. Yardley, publisher of the first black newspaper in Knoxville in 1878, called the Knoxville Examiner.
Yardley himself was an interesting man. He was one of those babies who was literally left on the doorstep of a white family, even though he was a black child. His mother was a white woman. That family raised him and taught him a trade, and he became Knoxville's first black lawyer in 1871 and was a candidate for governor of the state of Tennessee in 1876.
Yardley ran on a platform of equal rights, demanding big changes such as removing the word colored from all state laws, advocating for integration of schools, interracial marriage, and money to help blacks leave the South.
In the Conference of Colored Men at Nashville, WUF Yardley of Knoxville offered a resolution which was unanimously adopted, asking of the Congress of the United States an appropriation of $500,000 to aid in the removal of the colored people from the South. In support of his resolution, Yardley delivered a brief speech in favor of migration, saying that he was willing to leave the state and go to any place where he could enjoy the rights to which he was entitled.
So 2 years after that race, he began publishing his newspapers. And that Knoxville Examiner is a very good example of what black newspapers could be, even at that early date and time.
He has advertisements, he has shorts, he has a church directory, so he gives you a sense of what was available in news organization at the time. It wasn't just about race. He was addressing topics of the times.
Dr. Karen Fitzgerald Dunlap is a retired journalism professor who in 1982 produced the first comprehensive study of the black press in Tennessee.
At one point, the average lifespan nationally of black publications was 7 years. And you look at papers that you didn't see lasting over a year.
Dunlap says in the years after the Civil War, 1865 to 1899, almost 1,200 black newspapers were started in the United States. 70% were in the South, and Tennessee outdistanced many states that had larger black populations. Dunlap found that at least 34 black newspapers were published in Tennessee during this period.
So you might have 5 papers that ceased publication, and you had 5 more starts, 6 more starts. So you didn't see a huge change over the decades in the number of papers. It just might have been what they were. And then what were they saying?
What black newspapers were saying changed noticeably by the late 1800s, fueled by unrest among African Americans as Southern states began to roll back voting and civil rights through separate but equal practices, paving the way for legal discrimination under the Jim Crow system. It was a disappointing, frightening time that increased the demand by African Americans for current, useful, and uplifting information.
In this era in which life is dangerous, it takes a lot of courage to start a business, to be an entrepreneur. It takes a lot of courage to speak up for people, even if you weren't in your advocacy, you weren't being negative, you were just saying, and as a lot of them did, let's get an education. One of the big messages was, let's get an education, let's get an education.
To the west in Memphis, flourishing educational institutions from grade school through college created a reading population ripe and eager for black publications. But it was to the southeast in Chattanooga that black newspapers were gaining traction.
Chattanooga in the post-Civil War decades was one of the most interesting cities in Tennessee because it had been a Union-occupied town. Now, I think because of this sort of heavy federal presence and Union generals helps to explain why Chattanooga becomes one of the first cities to develop a really significant African American press. The Chattanooga Blade is the newspaper, and the journalist is Randolph Miller.
Miller was a former slave who'd been freed during General Sherman's march through the South near the end of the Civil War. Miller made his way to Chattanooga, where he was eventually hired by the newspaper as a printing operator. Working as a pressman at the Chattanooga Times for the next decade gave him knowledge and confidence to operate his own newspaper starting in 1896. Also, and importantly, Miller got a boost from his former boss, Adolph Oaks, who later purchased the New York Times and turned it into one of the world's top newspapers.
Evidence indicates that maybe he helped Miller get started with his own newspaper because Oaks knew full well that in Chattanooga by the 1890s, giving African Americans a full voice in the local newspaper was not good for business. But he wanted that voice to be there.
Miller was a bold, exciting writer who did not pull punches.
In that day and time, they called proponents of civil rights and talked about equality and advancements for African Americans, race people. He was a race man. He just had a kind of a quirky, kind of unusual way of expressing himself.
They have taken our part of the library. They've moved our school to the frog pond. They've passed the Jim Crow law. They've knocked us out of the jury box. They've played the devil generally, and what in thunder more will they do? No one knows.
We find him among a group of very few former slaves who were able to start their own newspaper and be fairly successful. Some of them lasting for a very short time, and even if they lasted long, it was very hard to keep them going.
Having witnessed the going to the wall of over 50 attempts by some of my colored friends to operate a newspaper, even in companies sometimes, I resolved upon trying the stunt myself, and there the Blade was founded. Thereupon I began with nothing but an ambition and an invincible heart.
I think he had that self-confidence to propel him into the newspaper business. And that was so important at that time because increasingly the dominant press is saying to African Americans, well, you should be a laborer, you should be in the fields or in the factories. The idea that you could be a professional, well, that was not endorsed by the dominant newspapers and the schools of the time. That was something that took inner strength to accomplish, and I think Miller is one of those individuals.
You saw that there were black journalists around the country who were becoming better known, who were writing more standard news stories. The news of the day included the Spanish-American War. You had heroes.
So African-American newspapers also, especially by the 1890s, will have an international aim as well. And that international aim in the 1890s will be speaking out against American imperialism. That is, American foreign policy abroad. Just as they had spoken out about how bad African Americans were being treated in the country and they should go west to Kansas. They were very critical in arguing that blacks should go to Haiti, that they should continue the Liberian movement, moving to West Africa.
The focus on migration to other regions was prompted by the horrifying events happening in this country, especially in the South, where thousands of African Americans were victims of racial violence.
You had this constant repetition in the white press of what was referred to as the black brute. It was so much a part of white vocabulary before the turn of the 20th century that it became a kind of a cultural artifact, if you will. And that influenced, quite frankly, that concept influenced lynching. Black press, black newspapers served as a counterbalance to that and talked about the accomplishments, the achievements of African Americans.
Some began to focus on African American community institutions, so building up those institutions. Others began to challenge it in terms of this activism, like Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells was born a slave in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She came of age during Reconstruction, was educated, and became a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. Even while teaching, Wells began writing under a pen name for literary and religious publications. By age 27, she made headlines herself, suing a railroad company for discriminatory seating.
For many African American men and women, like Ida B. Wells, they were coming off of the period of Reconstruction. They would have simply been able to go to the theater and sit wherever they wanted to sit, or to get on the train and sit in the first-class car if you bought a ticket, a first-class ticket. And then things began to change in the late 1870s and the 1880s. Well, Ida B. Wells gets on the train and she's bought a ticket for the first-class car. But then the conductor says, no, you've got to sit in the car that we have reserved for African-American passengers, which is the smoking car. And she refuses, and she is thrown off the train.
Wells sued the railroad company and won, but the case was overthrown by the Tennessee Supreme Court, and Wells was viciously berated in white newspapers.
You could say that Ida B. Wells she's been taught a lesson that she didn't want to learn. And in learning that lesson, maybe it makes her even a little more militant. She doesn't back down, she doesn't compromise.
Wells uses her pen as a weapon of protest. And in 1889, she becomes a writer and part owner of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. She focused on segregation, race relations, and injustices, printing the newspaper on pink paper to make it easily recognizable. Her following grew with subscriptions throughout the Delta in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas.
Our circulation lead increased in less than 1 year, from 1,500 to 4,000. And my salary came to within $10 of what I had received as a teacher.
Wells began to investigate lynchings of African Americans, and she questioned white newspapers and journalists who condoned lynchings.
In Memphis in the 1890s, Edward Ward Carmack was a competing journalist to Ida B. Wells. He was a staunch segregationist, and in fact, he believed that African Americans were inferior.
There is nothing which so fills the soul with horror, loathing, and fury as the outraging of a white woman by a Negro. It's the race question in the ugliest, vilest, and most dangerous aspect. The Negro as a political factor can be controlled, but neither laws nor lynchings can subdue his lusts.
8 Negroes lynched since last issue of the Free Speech. Nobody in this section of the country believes the old, threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached, which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women.
She's written this editorial, a really scathing editorial, about the causes of lynching. She's out of the city at the time, and then her newspaper press is destroyed. And she's just seriously advised, you shouldn't come back to Memphis because things are really bad here, and you will be killed if you come back.
Carmack reacted violently in his press, calling for the destruction of Wells's operation and maybe even hinting at physical violence towards her if she stayed in the city. He comes to Nashville a few years later, starts a great dispute in the press over temperance laws, and ends up being assassinated. There's a statue to Edward Ward Carmack at the state capitol today that makes mention of his staunch stand for temperance and his assassination. But something probably should also be said about how Carmack was. He was one of the more violent segregationists of his time.
Wells left Memphis but was not silenced or intimidated by her newspaper experience there. She continued to write and speak against lynching and racial injustices, traveling in the U.S. and Europe before settling in Chicago. She became an activist for women's suffrage and a founding member of the NAACP. And by many accounts, Ida B. Wells is one of the most influential female journalists in the nation's history.
I think if we could pick up a copy of Ida B. Wells's Free Speech and Headlight, it would be such a wonderful window into the Black community, which is what African American newspapers do. They're kind of like that space where African Americans can be militant or can be accommodationist or just be people.
The Free Speech and Headlight is the best illustration of how African American newspapers are the vanguard of the Black community, and they consider themselves the protector. They consider themselves the spokespersons for that particular community.
By the 20th century, Black newspapers were an important force in addressing issues of civil rights, racial violence, and negative stereotypes. As these publications grew in number, readership, and maturity, they established a solid foundation for a new generation of advocacy in Tennessee's Black press.
It's always been true in our culture that it's simply more difficult to be Black, be a person of color. And it's known in the academic literature as the Black tax. In other words, it's like a tax on being a Black person. And it's not right, it's unfair, and yet that is what the Black newspapers were trying to overcome, if you will, trying to help Black people overcome.
Through the ages, each era brought its different challenges. Each era brought its different cases to promote, to advocate, but in each time it was the African American press that had a big voice in moving forward.
The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and the First Tennessee Foundation.